time about how my abusive ex is dating my sister to get back at me. Disclaimer, this is not my story. I just want to clarify that my sister and I really have a good relationship. My parents taught us to be best friends, but my manipulative ex came between us. I met my ex in college, and he was the player of the school. He had a new girlfriend every single week, but for some reason, he decided to chase me. And of course, at first I was super flattered. He completely manipulated me into believing that he loved me, and that I was the most special girl out of everyone in the school, and that I wasn't like the other girls. The worst part is that my parents wanted me to focus on school, so I started dating him behind my parents' back. After dating for a few months, he started changing. He started getting super controlling and very jealous. He would monitor everything I did and ask me questions about everything. Who I was going out with, who my friends were, and God forbid there were any guys in my classes. He would stress me out so much that it would take my appetite away and I started losing weight. It got so bad that anytime he would text me or call me, my hands would start sweating and I would get instantly nervous. He always made me feel like I was in trouble or like I did something wrong. I decided to break up with him, so I went to his apartment and things went horribly wrong. As soon as I told him, he punched a hole into his wall and basically kidnapped me for 5 hours. He wouldn't let me leave his apartment. Part 2 is up. Storytime about how my abusive ex is dating my sister to get back at me. After I told him I didn't want to be with him anymore, he basically locked me in his apartment for 5 hours and he wouldn't let me leave. He punched a hole in his wall and just cried the entire time. I finally convinced him to let me leave, and after that he would not leave me alone. He started sending me flowers to convince me to get back with him, but I wouldn't respond to anything. For an entire week he would call me every single day, multiple times a day. Eventually I blocked his number and I thought that everything was fine. By the way, nobody knew that I was dating this guy. I didn't tell my parents because they didn't want me to be dating anyone during college. And of course I didn't tell my sister. I didn't want to stress her out. After a few weeks I went home for spring break. My family and I had planned to just stay home, watch movies, and eat good food. But when I got home, my sister started telling me about this new guy she met. At first, I was really excited for her until she showed me his Instagram. It was my ex. She told me he sent her a message on Instagram and that they had gone on a few dates. I was absolutely horrified. And right then and there, I told my sister the truth. I showed her all the abusive messages that he had sent me, and I told her about how controlling and jealous he was. But my sister started to cry and told me that she was already in love with him. My sister calls him and confronts him. That's when he told my sister that I was the abusive one, that he was trying to get away from me. Storytime about how my abusive ex is dating my sister to get back at me. That's when my crazy ex decided to tell my sister that I was the abusive one in the relationship and that I wouldn't leave him alone. At this point, I could tell my sister was super confused and hurt. I grabbed the phone from her and hung it up. I then explained to her that he was always so manipulative and that he would make me believe anything. I begged her to block him and she wouldn't. So I had no choice but to go to my parents and tell them the truth. I told them I had a boyfriend behind their back and that now he was trying to date my sister to get back at me. I told them the whole truth about how abusive he was, and of course my parents were devastated. They went to my sister's room, but she wasn't there anymore. That's when I found her phone and saw the messages. She went over to my ex's house. It's like he had her under the spell. So my parents and I went straight to my ex's house. That's when my sister told us that she would be moving in with him and that I was only trying to separate them because I was jealous. I got my friends to call her and tell her about how abusive he was, and she finally started believing them. My sister finally came home a few days later, but she still wants to be with him. I'm only 45 minutes away from school, so I decided to stay home. My parents and I are trying to keep her from seeing him. The good news is I finally got a restraining order against my ex. But what else can I do at this point? Please give me advice.
6 years ago, I switched my wife's cat with a more well-behaved lookalike. She had an all-black cat that was extremely aggressive. It scratched everyone, hissed at everyone, and didn't use its litter box half the time. My wife insisted she could get it to behave better. One week, she went out of town to visit her family, and I was supposed to go to her apartment and feed it. The first night I went over, I joked to the cat that it's not special and I'll replace it if it scratches again. The joke stuck with me until I had thought about it enough that it wasn't a joke. The next morning, I went to the local animal shelter. I found an identical cat that was already litter box trained and acclimated to people, but was a little skittish. But overall, it was a lot friendlier and better behaved, and the skittishness would help it resemble the original cat. So I adopted it, took it to my wife's apartment, settled it in, then drove her original cat to an animal shelter a town over. I was paranoid my wife would find out if I took it to a local one. It's been 6 years since then. We got married 4 years ago. We still have the swapped cat, and it answers to the original cat's name. My wife knows nothing. She loves this cat and brags about how much better behaved it is.
Stories about my long distance relationship that actually work. But if you're going to watch this because you think it's going to be lovey-dovey and encourage you to stay in yours, don't do it. Being in a long distance relationship takes a lot of trust, especially if your man or your girl is really fine. Because you know, if they're really fine, they're obviously going to get hit on all the time. And like me, I was like delicious, scrumptious. Everybody was in my DM. Okay, like 2 people, but you know what I mean. So if they were in my DMs, of course they were going to be in his. Well, anyways, I trusted him. I just didn't trust these conniving hoes in the street. And my reason being was because I wasn't being respected by some of his family members. And I say this because some of his family members were actively trying to get him with somebody else. They were out here giving his number like it was a coupon code. Like one time I remember he went to this church camp. And his cousin, who knew me, who had stayed in my house, gave this little girl his number without his permission. And I'm not saying this to defend him. If I didn't trust him, I would have been on the verge of tears. Like everybody fighting against you and your future. So make sure if you're dating somebody long distance, their family respects you too.
When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin. Unexpectedly, Nick's father passed away. So we make the trip up to New Hampshire. So that night as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. And then the door opens and this shadow figure walks into the room, but its hips are so high, I instantly was frozen with terror, and begins to walk down right next to me. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by? She's like, no. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. We get back from snowboarding and I'm laying in bed and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. The door opens, it walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. Walks down the aisle between me and Nick. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything. At the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me. She's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. I felt so helpless. That night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. Walks up the stairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep, so at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. Now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs and she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table and she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy, because scratched into the coffee table were the words, I love you. I was like, I'm done.
Story time about how I scammed my followers out of $20,000. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. I started out as an influencer on Instagram a few years ago. A few of my posts went viral, and after a month, I had 1 million followers. Suddenly, I had so many brands reaching out to me. Some of the brands I had never heard of, so I didn't really answer back. But I did start working with some brands that I did know. The only problem was that they would only pay me about $70 to $100 per post. By the way, I had a lot of debt at the time, so only making that much was not working for me. I decided to ask for more money, but some of the brands just wouldn't pay it. So by the end of the first month, I had only made about $500. That was not enough to pay my rent, and I was not about to get a day job. I had 1 million followers on Instagram. I was a glorified influencer. So instead, I started reaching out to some of these brands that I had never heard of before. One of them was offering me $5,000 to post a link on my story for 3 days. Of course, I accepted. Part of me thought that it was a scam, but I didn't care at the time. I needed the money. After 3 days of posting the link, they paid me the $5,000. I was able to pay my rent, my car insurance, and my phone bill. But here's the thing. I started getting a bunch of DMs from my followers who were super angry. They were calling me a scammer and a bunch of other names. So I decided to do some investigating, and I found out that the whole thing was a scam. Part 2 of how I scammed my followers out of $20,000. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me an Instagram. When I started seeing all the angry messages from my followers, I asked them what was wrong. One girl sent me screenshots of all the stuff that she had bought with the link that I posted. She told me that she Googled the company and that it was a scam. So I decided not to reply back to her. I wrote to the company and told them that I was getting a lot of hate messages. But of course, the company ghosted me. I saw 5 other messages and they were all basically saying the same thing. That the website was a total scam and that they had purchased stuff off of it. But here's the thing. For the first time, I had money. So I decided to just ignore it, which I know is a bad thing, but it's also their fault for not doing their research. But I did learn my lesson. After that, I Googled every single company that ever reached out to me. But here's where it gets worse. 2 weeks later, I get another $5,000 check from the same company. But I was so happy. I deposited that check really fast. So here's what I had to do. I blocked every single person who told me that the website was a scam. And then I just tried to forget about it. I also had to delete all the hate comments. And a few weeks after that, I get another $5,000 check. I had $15,000 in the bank. Part 3 is Part 3 of how I scammed my followers out of $20,000. Disclaimers is not my story time, it was sent to me on Instagram. I had made $15,000 from all of the scams, but it didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I got another $5,000 check. So in total, I had $20,000. This was the most money I'd ever had in my life, and I was not about to send it back. But I was still getting a lot of hate on Instagram. I ended up blocking over 500 people. And then finally, the company reached out to me. I told them my followers were saying that they were scamming them, but the company made up some excuse saying that the shipments had been delayed and that my followers would receive all their purchases. Then they offered me another $5,000 to post a different link. And guess what? Of course I accepted. They offered me $7,000 this time. I knew very well that this was probably another scam, but I still accepted. A few days later, I posted the link, but the payment never came. I waited a few weeks before contacting the company, and they ghosted me. I wrote to them every single day, but I never got the $7,000. So guess what? I also got scammed too. It's been 2 years since that happened, and I don't feel bad about it. I now make a lot more money than $20,000, but we all start somewhere. Part of me does feel guilty for scamming everyone, so sometimes I think about possibly paying them back. And don't start trying to guess in the comments who I am. You will never guess. Or maybe you will. Whatever, I'm $20,000 richer. Bye.
Bye, sisters.